It was supposed to be a routine cross-country flight, first class seat 1A, a quiet escape from a packed week of meetings. But for Malcolm Rhodes, one of the most powerful black CEOs in the country, what happened at 36,000 feet would become a national headline. Dressed in a hoodie and jeans, Malcolm didn't look like a billionaire that day, at least not to the flight crew. Minutes after boarding, he was approached by a flight attendant with a polite but firm request. Would he kindly give up his VIP seat for another preferred passenger, a white businessman, who according to the crew would be more comfortable sitting up front. What followed wasn't a shouting match or dramatic confrontation. Instead, Malcolm made one quiet phone call, and within hours the entire flight crew's careers were hanging by a thread. What they didn't know was that Malcolm wasn't just a passenger, he was a silent partner in the airline's parent company and close friends with its chairman. That single subtle act of discrimination spiraled into corporate chaos, mass firings, and a social movement that would dominate headlines. This isn't just a story about a seat, it's a story about dignity, perception, and the quiet power of knowing exactly who you are, even when the world assumes otherwise. It was a sunny Friday afternoon when Malcolm Rhodes, the 42-year-old CEO of a billion-dollar tech firm, stepped out of his black SUV at JFK Airport. He had just wrapped up a closed-door meeting with a group of investors, and although his schedule was packed with more boardrooms and press calls, today's flight to San Francisco felt like a small window of peace, alone. No staff, no cameras, just a few quiet hours in the sky. Despite his position as one of the most respected black entrepreneurs in the country, Malcolm always preferred to move through life quietly. He didn't wear power on his sleeve. Instead, it pulsed from within through his calm demeanor, measured speech, and the way people instinctively made room when he entered a room. He checked in with no fanfare, politely declined an offer to fast-track through TSA, and wheeled his own carry-on through the bustling terminal. Wearing a soft gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of clean designer sneakers, he looked more like someone heading to a tech conference than the man whose face had graced the cover of Forbes and Inc. magazines. Malcolm liked it that way. When he reached the gate for Flight 707 to San Francisco, he paused briefly to sip an espresso and read a few headlines on his phone. Nothing urgent, just market chatter, speculation about his company's latest AI acquisition, and a few congratulatory messages from friends. He didn't reply. He rarely did. That kind of success didn't need to be echoed. The gate attendant scanned his digital ticket and gave him a polite smile as he boarded early with other first-class passengers. Malcolm made his way to the front, where seat 1A awaited him, a large plush window seat with extra legroom, a reclining feature, and complimentary champagne already poured and waiting on the tray. He stored his bag neatly in the overhead bin, sat down and exhaled, finally able to relax for the first time that day. But then came the interruption. A flight attendant, mid-40s blonde, hair pulled tightly back, approached with a rigid posture and a forced smile. Her name tag read Karen, and her expression suggested she had a task to complete, one she didn't particularly enjoy. "Sir," she said, with the rehearsed professionalism of someone used to making people comply, "I think there's been a small mix-up with your seat." Malcolm looked up, puzzled. "I'm in 1A, that's what my boarding pass says." Karen's smile faltered for a split second before she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a confidential tone, the kind that carries subtle authority. "A valued guest has requested this seat. He prefers sitting in the front row. We've already made arrangements to move you to 3C. Malcolm blinked slowly. "You've already moved me," she nodded. "It's just a couple of rows back. Same service, same class. I'm sure you understand." Before Malcolm could respond, a tall white man in a tailored navy blue suit stepped onto the plane. He looked around briefly before locking eyes with Karen, who immediately brightened. "Right this way, Mr. Whitman," she said, her tone now warmer, almost deferential. Mr. Whitman didn't even look at Malcolm. He simply stood there expectantly, waiting for the exchange to happen, as if it were a given. Malcolm didn't move. The silence hung between them like fog. Karen shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat. Passengers behind them began to slow their steps, sensing something unusual unfolding. Malcolm calmly reached into the side pocket of his hoodie and pulled out his phone. He didn't raise his voice or gesture dramatically. He simply held the phone in his lap and looked up. "I paid for this seat. I'll be staying in 1A. Karen stiffened, clearly caught off guard by the refusal. "Sir, I assure you, this guest is a loyal flyer with our highest tier status. He prefers the front row, and we're doing everything we can to accommodate him." Malcolm tilted his head. So am I not a valued guest? The words weren't angry, but they landed with weight. Karen opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She stood there for a beat too long, uncertain of her next move. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitman's confident smirk began to falter. He looked at Karen, then back at Malcolm. "I didn't mean to cause a problem," he muttered. "You didn't," Malcolm replied, eyes still on the attendant. "She did." Another pause. Then Karen reached for her radio. "I'll get the cabin manager," she said quietly, turning and walking briskly toward the front of the plane. Malcolm sat back in his seat and placed his phone face down on the tray table. Around him, whispers began to travel through the cabin. A few people took out their phones, some pretending to check emails, others openly filming. Something about the scene was unmistakable, unjust, tense. Malcolm stared out the window, the New York skyline still visible in the distance. He knew this moment wasn't really about a scene. It was about something deeper, something far more familiar than most people were willing to admit, and he also knew something else. This flight was going to be delayed, but not for the reasons the crew expected. The cabin fell into a thick, almost tangible silence as Malcolm looked calmly at the uniformed woman standing in front of him. The cheerful flight attendant from earlier, Karen, now had her arms crossed and her smile replaced with a tight-lipped grimace. The easy confidence she had displayed moments ago was gone, replaced with the discomfort of someone who realized they were losing control of a situation they thought they could manage. "I'll stay in the seat I paid for," Malcolm said evenly, his voice steady and unshaken. Karen stared at him for a beat too long, as if waiting for him to change his mind, to cave under the weight of her authority, or perhaps the social expectation that a black man, no matter how wealthy or calm, should comply when gently told to move. But Malcolm wasn't moving. She exhaled through her nose, more annoyed than rattled, then reached for the small radio clipped to her hip. "This is Karen on flight 707. I need a cabin manager to the front. Passenger is refusing to comply with a seating reassignment." Her words were sharp, deliberate, and just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. The language was clinical, almost accusatory, as if Malcolm's calm refusal was some kind of disruption. Then, without another word, she turned and walked briskly down the aisle, heels tapping like warning shots. Malcolm remained seated, completely composed, eyes forward. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't reach for his phone again. He simply waited, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The passengers around him, business travelers, retirees and tech types in hoodies, had grown quiet. Some leaned slightly in his direction, others whispered. A few began discreetly filming, their phones angled subtly in the spaces between seat backs. There was something in the air now, tension, curiosity, and maybe a bit of unease. Moments later, the cabin manager arrived, a stocky man in a navy blazer, with a silver name tag that read. He had the forced smile of someone used to handling uncomfortable situations, a professional problem solver who had been trained to de-escalate without admitting fault. "Good afternoon, sir," Chris said, leaning down with a polished tone. "I understand there's been some confusion about the seating arrangements." "No confusion," Malcolm replied, his voice as calm as before. "I was asked to give up my seat for another passenger. I declined." Chris nodded, as if hearing a complicated explanation, though it was anything but. "I see. Well, unfortunately, this other guest is one of our highest priority flyers." Malcolm raised a hand, stopping him. "I don't need the explanation," he said. "I'm not moving. I'll wait for the captain if necessary." That landed harder than the cabin manager expected. His smile faded. The manager looked over his shoulder at Mr. Whitman, the tall white man still lingering awkwardly in the aisle. His posture was now less confident, his face slightly red. Mr. Whitman leaned in toward the manager and said quietly, "I didn't know this would be a thing. I just asked. I didn't want it to turn into a whole scene." Chris gave him a quick nod and turned back to Malcolm, whose presence in the seat now felt immovable, not just physically but morally. A quiet authority radiated from him, and the passengers could feel it. This wasn't about ego. This was about principle. Then, without fanfare, Malcolm reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through a short list of contacts, each one a first-name basis relationship most CEOs would kill for, and pressed the call button. When the line connected, he spoke clearly, his voice low enough not to shout, but just loud enough to be overheard. "Hi Lisa, get me Alan. Tell him it's urgent. Flight 707. I'll hold." The cabin manager frowned. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we do need to resolve this before takeoff. I'm sure we can find a compromise." Malcolm leaned back in his seat, phone still in hand. "You'll want to hold the plane. Trust me." That sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap. The manager blinked, Excuse me, I said. Malcolm repeated, still calm. You'll want to hold the plane. And that's when it began to shift, visibly, audibly, emotionally. Karen returned, standing beside the cabin manager, her jaw tense. She glanced at the man in 3C, then back at Malcolm. Security is on standby if needed, she muttered. Standby for what? Malcolm asked, a paying customer refusing to give up a paid seat for someone with more frequent flyer miles. The question wasn't for her, it was for everyone watching, and they were watching. Cameras were now out in full view. People weren't hiding it anymore. One woman leaned across the aisle to her husband and whispered, "This is going to go viral." Then the unthinkable happened. Malcolm's phone lit up with a name, Alan Markham, chairman of the airline's board and CEO of its parent conglomerate. Malcolm tapped accept and put the phone to his ear. "Hey Alan, I'm on flight 707. Got a bit of a situation. Apparently I'm not high priority enough for the seat I paid for." There was a long pause as Alan responded on the other end. The manager and Karen watched with growing concern. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I'll let you handle it." Then he ended the call. The manager shifted uncomfortably. Karen looked as if she was about to speak, then stopped. Something was very, very wrong, and it was dawning on them quickly. Malcolm leaned back again and folded his arms. He wasn't going anywhere, but someone else's job just might. 20 long minutes had passed. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had shifted from routine to electric. Flight 707 still hadn't taken off, and passengers were growing restless, not with Malcolm, but with the airline. Dozens of phones were still recording, tweets were already circulating, and whispers flowed from row to row. The man in seat 1A, once mistaken for just another hoodie-wearing traveler, was now at the center of something far bigger than a seating dispute. Then finally, the cockpit door opened, with a soft click, and out stepped the captain. He was in his late 50s, tall, with silver hair and a commanding presence, dulled only slightly by the flustered look on his face. His pilot's cap sat crooked on his head, as though he had put it on in a rush. Beads of sweat glistened on his brow. His hands were still stained faintly with ink from the flight manifest. He walked down the aisle with purpose, but paused when he reached Malcolm. "Mr. Rhodes," he said, his voice tight but respectful, "I just became aware of the situation. I want to personally apologize. This is not how we operate." Malcolm simply looked at him. The captain swallowed, glancing nervously at the cluster of watching passengers and filming phones. "Let's get this sorted," the captain added. But he didn't sound confident. He sounded like a man who'd been pulled into a political storm far above his pay grade. Just then Karen's radio crackled sharply, breaking the tense silence. "Karen, come to the cockpit, now." She flinched. The voice was hard, clipped, and urgent. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit door, then back at the captain, who was now clearly sweating more. I'll be right there," Karen muttered, and turned. But what happened next would shift the entire tone of the situation in an instant. As Karen opened the cockpit door and stepped inside, the internal phone system was still connected, and someone had accidentally hit the intercom button. From the speakers above, the cabin heard a voice, low, furious, and unmistakably powerful. It was Alan Markham, the chairman of the airline. His words echoed through the cabin like a live broadcast from Olympus. "Find out why my oldest friend and our biggest investor is being harassed on my airline, and fix it before I ground every flight you operate." Gasps rippled through the cabin. You could hear the sound of jaws drop. Karen froze mid-step. Chris, the cabin manager, slowly stepped backward, his face drained of color. His earlier confidence had evaporated into thin air. The captain looked like he'd just been punched in the chest. Malcolm remained still, calm, like he knew this would happen all along. Passengers, once just curious observers, now leaned into their seats with widened eyes. The name Alan Markham carried weight. That was the Alan Markham, CEO of the holding company that owned multiple airlines, freight carriers, and even a luxury cruise line, a billionaire in his own right. And now it was clear, Malcolm Rhodes wasn't just any passenger. He was a man whose phone call had rattled the very top of the aviation food chain. Whispers broke out again, but this time it was his name being passed around like a secret. Malcolm Rhodes, the tech guy, from Next Tech A. He's the one who partnered with Tesla for that global energy grid thing. I heard he's worth $8 billion. I read he's on the board of 3 Fortune 500 companies. Now every eye was on him, but not in suspicion or scrutiny. It was admiration, respect, even awe. Mr. Whitman, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. His smug demeanor was gone. He looked at Malcolm, then down at his shoes, then quickly returned to his new seat in 3C without a word. Inside the cockpit, chaos was unfolding, though the door remained shut. Karen hadn't come back. The captain hadn't moved, but Malcolm, he sat there, relaxed, one leg crossed over the other. He wasn't angry, he didn't gloat, his posture spoke volumes. I didn't need to shout, you just needed to listen. Eventually Chris approached again, this time with the defeated energy of someone facing inevitable consequences. Mr. Rhodes, he said quietly, we sincerely apologize. You may of course remain in 1A. The flight will resume shortly. Malcolm didn't reply. He simply gave a slow nod, and with that Chris retreated. A full 10 minutes later, the cockpit door opened again, and Karen walked out. Her face was pale, her lips were pursed. She didn't look at Malcolm, she didn't look at anyone. She walked straight down the aisle, past first class, and into the galley. She wouldn't be returning. The captain came back on the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be pushing back in just a few moments. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. And again, thank you for flying with us. But it wasn't just another flight anymore. Passengers looked around as if waking up from a dream. They'd just witnessed the beginning of something bigger, a story they'd tell their friends, their families, even strangers. They were part of a viral moment, a reckoning in real time, and as the engines began to hum and the plane started to taxi, Malcolm stared out the window. He hadn't said much, but his silence had thundered, and the skies ahead were about to change, forever. Flight 707 sat still on the tarmac, its engines humming softly beneath a bright blue sky as the minutes stretched into a drawn-out 45-minute delay. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, whispering among themselves, and scrolling furiously through their phones, watching as the story that had erupted on board quickly began to spread beyond the cabin walls. Malcolm Rhodes remained in his seat, 1A, calm and collected as ever. He held a worn paperback in his hands, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, a quiet nod to the invisible burdens he carried throughout his life and career. The book's words blended with the murmur of conversations and the occasional click of a camera shutter as passengers continued recording the incident in real time. The atmosphere inside the plane had changed entirely. Gone was the tension from before. Now, a curious energy filled the cabin, less confrontation and more quiet acknowledgement. Malcolm's presence no longer went unnoticed, but was met with respect, even admiration. The two airline employees who had sparked the conflict, Karen and Chris, the cabin manager, were nowhere to be seen. They had disappeared after the captain's announcement, replaced by new flight attendants, whose faces were carefully neutral and who moved silently through the aisles, avoiding any unnecessary interaction. Across the aisle, in seat 3C sat the man who had requested Malcolm's seat. Miss Whitman stared at his lap, clearly uncomfortable and avoiding all eye contact. He didn't speak to Malcolm, or glance his way once during the flight. The once confident businessman now seemed diminished, caught in the shadow of a story he had unwittingly helped create. Throughout the cabin, conversations sparked like wildfire. Passengers exchanged texts, posted tweets, and uploaded videos with the hashtag that had begun trending within minutes. VIP Wild. By the time the plane finally roared into the sky, the incident was no longer just a private dispute on a single flight. It had become a national conversation, a powerful narrative exposing deep-seated bias and systemic inequality, unfolding in real time before thousands of witnesses. As Flight 707 cruised at 35,000 feet, the viral storm gathered momentum. Social media accounts, news outlets, and opinion columns dissected every moment of the incident, with Malcolm Rhodes at the center, a symbol of resilience, dignity, and the refusal to be sidelined. Back at the airline's headquarters, the fallout was swift and uncompromising. Executives held an emergency meeting as footage from the flight looped on screens in boardroom. The CEO of the airline's parent company issued a statement pledging a full and transparent investigation into the conduct of the Flight 707 crew. Within hours, the airline announced the suspension of the entire crew involved in the incident, pending investigation. By the next day, the investigation's findings had surfaced quietly, but decisively. 5 staff members, including Karen and Chris, were fired for discrimination and misconduct. The airline promised to implement new training programs and diversity initiatives, though many critics remained skeptical. But the story didn't end there. In the days that followed, Malcolm Rhodes found himself at the epicenter of a movement he hadn't sought but could not ignore. Calls flooded in, from civil rights organizations, fellow CEOs and politicians, who saw his courage as a beacon for change. Invitations arrived to speak at forums, panels and conferences. His story became a rallying cry for those tired of invisible barriers and unspoken rules. Despite the whirlwind, Malcolm remained grounded. He returned to his office, overlooking the city skyline, where his team was already preparing a public statement. He chose his words carefully, firm but hopeful, acknowledging the painful realities, while emphasizing the possibility of progress. Yet behind the headlines and accolades, Malcolm knew the real work was just beginning. Discrimination was not a problem solved by firing a few employees or a viral video. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life, subtle and insidious. But for the first time in a long time, the conversation had shifted, and Malcolm Rhodes had helped change that. As the plane descended towards San Francisco, the city lights twinkled like stars beneath the night sky, a reminder that even in darkness, there was light to be found. Malcolm's phone buzzed again, a new message, another call to action. The journey was far from over. 3 days after the Flight 707 incident, Malcolm Rhodes sat quietly in his sleek minimalist office, overlooking the city skyline. The events from the past week, every tense moment on the plane, every whispered conversation, every viral clip, had settled into something far bigger than he had ever anticipated. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, but this time, the spotlight had found him, and he was ready to use it. Sitting in front of his phone, Malcolm recorded a short video for his company's social media channels, one he knew would reach millions. The camera caught him in his natural state, calm, composed and resolute. "I didn't want this to become a public storm," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "But too often, those who look like me are told, directly or subtly, that we don't belong in spaces we've earned. That ends now." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This isn't just about one seat on one flight. It's about the countless invisible barriers that hold us back every day. Barriers built on assumptions, biases, and old prejudices. It's about respect, opportunity, equality. The video, no longer than 2 minutes, quickly spread like wildfire. Social media feeds exploded with the hashtag #VIPWhileblack. Now not only a story but a rallying cry. News outlets across the country picked up the narrative, framing Malcolm's quiet resistance as a powerful example of dignity in the face of discrimination. Civil rights organizations, activists, and influencers praised Malcolm's calm but firm stand. His message resonated deeply with many who had faced similar moments of exclusion, but lacked the platform or voice to speak out. Within just 1 week, the airline that had once tried to quietly dismiss the incident found itself in a new chapter of accountability and change. The company announced mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all employees across its entire network, from ticket agents to flight attendants to senior management. But more notably, Malcolm was invited to join the airline's newly formed board of advisors, a group dedicated to shaping policies on diversity, equity and inclusion. The invitation was unprecedented for a passenger, let alone someone who had confronted the airline head-on. Yet Malcolm knew this was only the beginning. The true power of the incident lay not in punishment or policy change alone, but in the opportunity to create something lasting, a platform to uplift, educate, and empower. Just days after his video went viral, Malcolm quietly launched the Altitude Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to opening doors for young Black travelers and professionals. Its mission was clear: to break down barriers in industries where access and representation were scarce, especially in aviation, technology and business leadership. Altitude Initiative began with scholarships, mentorship programs, and partnerships with airlines and corporations eager to foster diversity and inclusion. The organization also hosted workshops on leadership, networking, and financial literacy, providing tools young people needed to soar in spaces traditionally closed off. Malcolm's vision was simple but profound: to ensure that the next generation of Black leaders never felt the sting of being told they didn't belong, whether on a plane, in a boardroom, or anywhere else their dreams might take them. What started as a seemingly small confrontation over one seat on a flight had ignited a movement far beyond the confines of a single cabin. The media dubbed it the seat that changed the sky. As Malcolm spoke at events and shared his story, he often returned to a single idea: all progress begins with someone refusing to move, someone refusing to be invisible, someone saying, "I belong here." His journey, once marked by quiet determination, had become a beacon of hope. And as more young people joined the Altitude Initiative, sharing their stories, their dreams, their victories,
the movement grew stronger. Malcolm Rhodes, the CEO who had simply taken his seat, had become a symbol of change, of courage and of the power one person holds when they stand firm. And all it took was one seat. What began as a routine flight became a defining moment, not just for Malcolm Rhodes, but for everyone watching. It wasn't about a seat, it was about dignity, principle, and the quiet power of standing your ground. Malcolm didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten anyone, he simply refused to be displaced, literally and symbolically. And through that one decision, he reminded the world that respect isn't given by uniforms, titles, or seat numbers. It's earned through action, and demanded by those who know their worth. Sometimes the strongest statement you can make is to stay seated. Thanks for watching Hidden Reality. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real-world inspired stories that uncover the truth beneath the surface. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a quiet act of resistance that changed everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Until next time, stay aware and stay powerful.